Well, what's not going to be a surprise to anyone, about 2 weeks ago, I preached what I thought could be a standalone sermon, and God has let that continue to stir in my heart. And that standalone is likely becoming a series of messages that I'm going to be looking at over the next few weeks. A couple weeks ago, we looked at Nehemiah's story, and I asked a question like, what is your burden? What stirs in you? Remember Nehemiah? He heard from his brothers about the status of Jerusalem, the walls being torn down and the condition of the exiles, and it broke him. He mourned, he fasted and prayed because of what he heard. He spent at least 3 months praying about what he heard. Step one I talked about was identifying your burden. What is it that stirs you? What is the burden that God, now I didn't say that man or that you placed in yourself, but the burden, which is why it was so important for step 2. We must pray to make sure that the burdens inside of us, the stirrings inside of us aren't driven by us, but they're authored by God. So then what is step 3? What do we do next? We've wrestled with a burden, we've wrestled with a stirring, and we've prayed about it, and we feel like God is doing this. He's calling us to do something about this situation or circumstance. So step 3 for Nehemiah, we can find it in Nehemiah chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine, I gave it to the king, and I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, "What is your face? Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill?" "This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" And I prayed to God of heaven. And I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servants found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy." And because of the gracious hand of God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates and gave the king's letters. The king had also sent armies and cavalry with me. So what did Nehemiah do next? He identified a burden. He knew his heart was broken about the condition of the walls and the state of Jerusalem. He prayed about that burden, and then when given an opportunity, he communicated. He shared the burden that God had placed in his heart. I believe that many Christian stirrings, that many Christian burdens aren't fully accomplished or fully fulfilled because they're never expressed. After prayer, months, weeks, or years, we need to share the burden God places inside of us with someone else. Nehemiah shared the burden. He shared the burden with the king. He shared the plan over and over again. We'll look at it several times today. But as he's talking to the king, he says, "Hey, here's what's wrong with me." You know what happens when I speak something? When I speak something to someone, there is accountability that comes. I'm guessing with Nehemiah, once he has this interaction with the king, he's asked for these letters, he's asked for these reports. If he doesn't go and do something about it, the king is going to hold him accountable. He's not going to let him mope around and pout. He's going to tell him to get about what he set out to do. There's accountability when we share the burden. There's something about our word that is powerful, an identifier of where I live, what I call cowboy culture. One of the pillars, I believe, is that a cowboy's word is everything, right? A handshake agreement is just as powerful, is just as binding as a written contract in their culture. I mean, a man without his word is nothing. Last week I was talking to someone about some legal things they were going through, and they mentioned verbal contracts. And yeah, there's legal ramifications of verbal contracts. They're as binding as written contracts, right? But the problem is they're a little bit harder to prove. See, our words, they bind us to something when we communicate them. When we communicate a burden of God, it brings accountability in our life. Just a quick personal testimony. I was praying, just like I asked everyone to in church that Sunday I preached on Nehemiah's burden. As I prayed about a burden, I expected to hear something ministry related in my local church or in my community. I thought maybe that would be what God would bring to my heart. And as I prayed, God reminded me of what stirs me. And one of the things that truly stirs me is the condition of the rural church. That's the perception of rural church. That's the churches that are dying in rural communities. That's the way in which others receive rural churches. Everything about rural churches, it stirs me, it compels me. And God reminded me of that burden. I have a burden that rural churches in towns of 500 or towns of 5,000 can be thriving, effective ministries with powerful, anointed pastors, educated pastors that can serve in these areas. We don't have to settle for less or settle for something short. We can be excellent, do excellent ministries, and have excellent effect in the kingdom of God or impact in His kingdom in rural churches all over the place. My heart breaks as rural churches close, as we see churches that aren't working or effectively ministering in communities. I prayed and I'm like, God, I don't know. That seems so much bigger than me. What can I do? And a couple days later, I got an email from Evangel University, probably because I'm alumni or maybe because I'm a student. And it said that the university received a $7.5 million grant. And I think I clicked on that email with a little cynicism in my heart, thinking about what I've spent for my education and what are they going to use this $7.5 million for. But as soon as I read the cynicism in my heart, the tune of cynicism changed. I read that this $7.5 million grant that the university had received was all for supporting rural churches across the United States. This is what stirs me. They said they wanted to develop educational resources, internships, extensive resource hubs, resourcing the rural church. That's a tune that my heart sings with. I did something very out of my nature. I emailed the president of Evangel University, and I just said, here is who I am. I'm a student. I graduated from there. I'm going to school there. I pastor a church in a rural community, and I want to help resourcing rural churches. Is there any way I can help? Part of me never expected to hear any response, but I knew I had to do this. You see, I had to share the burden because there's accountability when we shared the burden. In the meantime, after I shared it with him, I saw in that email that 13 different state assemblies of gods were involved with this program. And so I thought maybe our state would be. So I talked to my superintendent, who will hold me accountable to what I shared with him, the burden of my heart for rural ministry. He didn't know anything about it, so I wasn't sure where this was going. And I got a response. I got an email back in a couple days. When I read that email, it was an email from the vice president of AGTS, the seminary that I'm going to, inviting me to a video conference call just to be able to discuss some of these things. It's suddenly my burden when expressed, when I shared it with someone, there was accountability that came. There's accountability that comes when we share the burden. Not only is there accountability, but when we continue reading, Nehemiah said, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I hadn't told anyone what God put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there wasn't enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back, re-entered through the valley gate. The officials didn't know where I'd gone or what I was doing because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or the officials or any others who would be doing the work. You see, Nehemiah said, I hadn't shared anything yet, but something powerful happens when we share the burden God has placed on our heart. Not only is there accountability, but it says, then I said to them, you see, the trouble we're in, Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of God on me and what the king had said to me, and they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Sharing a burden not only brings personal accountability, but it brings a contagious vision. Passion breeds passion. People are compelled by your burdens. When we share our burdens, it's likely to resonate with someone's heart who we share it to that will want to partner with us in fulfilling God's plan for this burden or this stirring in our life. Last week, we weren't live. We didn't do a sermon because we had a mission service. And what is a mission service? A missionary comes to a church. They share their burden. And the church becomes excited and they partner with this missionary in finances and prayer for what God is doing in their life. Because burden breeds passion. Sharing a burden brings a contagious vision that others long to be a part of. So not only does sharing a burden bring accountability, not only does it bring contagious vision, but it brings a radical boldness. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, and Geshem, the Arab, heard about it, they mocked us and ridiculed us. What is this thing you're doing? They asked, are you rebelling against the king? And I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim to or historic right to it. Nehemiah's burden express resulted in boldness when there was those who would oppose the fulfillment of his burden. I promise you, as you set out to take care of or to fulfill or to address the burden or stirring in your heart, there will be enemies that arise. There will be opposition that comes that tries to hinder you from doing what you've set out to accomplish. But when we've shared the burden, there's accountability. When we've shared the burden, there's a contagious passion. And when we've shared the burden, there's a radical boldness that comes in us that we're not afraid, we're not ashamed of others when they come and try to attack us because we know why. We've prayed about this burden and God placed it in our heart. We've shared this burden and others have bought into it. They've held us accountable to it. And we're going to accomplish what God said he would accomplish. There's a radical boldness that comes in that. Later on in Nehemiah 6, it says the fifth time, Sanballat, he sent his aide to me with the same message. So he's trying over and over to persuade Nehemiah to stop. And Nehemiah sends this reply, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your head. He says to his enemies in a boldness that comes from a shared burden, sharing his burden. He says, you're crazy. You're foolish. When we share our burden, it brings accountability. When we share our burden, it brings contagious passion. And when we share our burden, it brings radical boldness into our lives. I encourage you, once you've discovered what God is stirring in you, once you've realized the burden he's placed inside of you, pray about it. When you pray about it and you know this is from God, share it with someone. Then share it with someone's. And then be ready to use it as the catalyst for boldness when anyone tries to stand in the way of what God wants to accomplish through your life. The Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you, may he turn his face towards you, grant you his peace, and may you share the burden God has placed in you. Be blessed.